From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Ohio voters resoundingly say no to a ballot question that was widely viewed as a proxy vote on abortion. Is this another warning to the GOP about the power of abortion politics in the wake of Dobbs? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder Odell. Issue 1 on Tuesday's ballot in Ohio does not mention abortion at all. The question was whether to raise the threshold to amend the state constitution from a simple majority to 60% of voters. But the clear context is what's coming in November, which is a ballot initiative to put abortion rights in the state constitution. And so issue 1 ultimately was rejected by the voters, 57% to 43%. Here's a clip of Dennis Willard, a spokesman for the Vote No campaign, followed by the Ohio Republican Senate President, Matt Huffman.
Tonight is a major victory for democracy in Ohio. The majority still rules in Ohio.
Obviously, I'm personally very disappointed. I think it's a question that was worth asking of the voters, not only because of the two issues that are on the ballot in November, but the 6 to 10 that are planned over the next couple of years.
Kim, what do you make of this? It's a 14-point loss for issue 1 in a state that President Trump won by, I believe, 8 points in 2020.
Yeah, I don't see how you can see this as anything else other than a statement on abortion questions. Look, what this ballot initiative would have done is it would have done two things. It would have raised the threshold for getting an initiative on the ballot by essentially changing the number of signatures, et cetera, you needed to get. But then it also would have, as you noted, raised the vote level threshold to 60% if you wanted to get it passed and put into the state constitution. And I think that in general, this question about whether or not 50% plus 1 is a good idea of how you should run democracy. It's essentially direct democracy, which is something our founders had some concern over. That might have been more of a debate in Ohio, and this might have been a closer vote in the end, were it not for the fact that Republicans in particular decided to very much tie this to the abortion question and warned that there was this ballot initiative coming later in the year that is going to enshrine abortion rights into the Constitution, that it could pass with a 50% majority unless this effort succeeded. They were also warning about a lot of other things that could potentially pass with 50% plus 1 vote, that a lot of Ohioans care about, things like gun rights, things like parental consent laws, noting that it makes it easier when you have this 50% threshold for outside special interest groups to come in and spend a lot of money and fearmonger over some of these issues, and that some of the things they care about could get tossed down the bin. But the reality is that because they brought up this abortion point, it really gave the left an opportunity to themselves claim that if the threshold was raised, that abortion rights would be at risk. And we've seen this similar thing happen in other states. And I think it suggests to Republicans, this was essentially a proxy vote on that upcoming abortion initiative. And Republicans have been losing those votes across the states because there's a big section of voters in the middle who don't necessarily want to see some of the tougher restrictions that Republicans are advocating for, including in Ohio, where they currently have a heartbeat law that is under litigation, but is potentially going to go into effect.
To the point about tying issue 1 to this coming abortion vote, here's a quote from Republican Secretary of State Frank LaRose. He said, "This is 100% about keeping a radical pro-abortion amendment out of our Constitution. The left wants to jam it in there this coming November." And I tend to agree with Kim that I think direct democracy has its problems. You can see some of those if you look at the amendment and initiative process in California, where you end up with very specific policies embedded in the state constitution. You end up with a ballot with 5 or 10 or 15 different really complicated initiatives on them, and it takes voters a long time to try to figure out the details of these. This is why we delegate elected representatives to work through some of the muddiness of these policy questions. And sometimes you end up with initiatives that conflict. And my understanding is when that happens, if you have two initiatives that conflict on the ballot, the one that wins with a greater percentage of the vote is the one that supersedes the other one, even if they both end up passing with a majority. And so I am skeptical that this is a great way to run a representative democracy. But there also may be some concerns that people had about the fact that this vote was coming in August, 3 months before the abortion referendum is supposed to come. And so, Kate, it will be fascinating to see if there's any gap between this result on issue 1 and what we get in November, because there may be people who like the majority rules thesis. They like direct democracy, even if they have not bought into the abortion amendment that is coming down the pike.
Right. I mean, just to underscore your skepticism of 50+1 rule on everything. I mean, when, for instance, another example I think of is from the Affordable Care Act, expanding Medicaid. Often in some legislatures that couldn't get through, and then progressives would try to get it on the ballot and jam it through that way and do all sorts of things via ballot referendum that they couldn't accomplish in the legislature. So I think legislatures tend to produce a more durable political consensus. So it's really a pity that this couldn't be a discussion about the merits of the question and whether 50+1 is any way to run the joint. There is some, I'm sure, the 50+1 is now a article of faith on the left. And so I'm sure that layered on even more voters who were animated by the abortion question. But of course, this was a proxy for the abortion vote. I think it will be interesting to see if the actual referendum is any closer. I mean, Ohio sent J.D. Vance to the Senate recently. It could potentially be closer. This was a blowout, 57-43. So I think could potentially be closer. But at the same time, I think the pro-life movement needs to read this result and reflect upon it and consider why the current strategy that they have to persuade people to their position on abortion is not working. This is not the first kind of question on abortion that's come up in the states, and similar questions have been defeated, and the details being different, but questions on abortion have been defeated in states like Kansas and Kentucky, which are not progressive strongholds or strong blue states. So I think what we see here is reason to really revisit the persuasion strategy of the pro-life movement and get more Americans on board with those views instead of continuing to fight these battles and lose.
So now the debate in Ohio will turn to the context of this abortion amendment. And I will just read a bit of the proposed language. It says, every individual has a right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions. The state cannot burden that right. It says abortion may be prohibited after fetal viability, but not if the physician believes it's necessary to protect the pregnant patient's life or health. And Kim, some of the arguments that the pro-life community is going to raise as we get toward November is Ohio has a law that generally requires parental consent if there is a minor seeking an abortion. And is that in conflict with this language that says every individual has a right to make and carry out one's own reproductive decisions? And as for the exception for health after the fetus becomes viable, does that include mental health? Does that include financial or familial health? And maybe those arguments will be persuasive to some Ohioans, but it is notable that those are exactly the same arguments that were made in Michigan when Michigan had an abortion rights amendment on the ballot last year. And the Michigan amendment passed pretty soundly nonetheless. It was 57% to 43%.
Which is why we'll see how the right does in explaining this initiative and the stakes to people in Ohio, because they haven't done a great job in the past. What we've seen, and it's rolled out the same way a couple of times now, is that in response to either real Republican legislation that's a little bit more restrictive on abortion or claims that they're going to do so by the left then puts forward these ballot initiatives where they claim that all they're doing is trying to seek to preserve abortion rights, when in fact what we have are these ballot initiatives that go far beyond anything that we ever saw in terms of the protections with Roe v. Wade, and go far beyond what a lot of the states had accepted in terms of abortion rights up until now. And you name a couple of good examples. We saw that also in the Kansas fight and in the Michigan fight, where what voters ultimately adopted under the belief that they were simply preserving abortion rights are these quite expansive abortion regimes, including these questions of whether or not they are eviscerating the ability of parents to have any role in that decision for minors, given the burden language that is in this particular initiative. And indeed, these kind of potential sweeping carve-outs for any physician who says a health is at risk, is that someone's, we think of that as the mother's life at stake, but the addition of the word or health opens up the door. Could that include their mental health? Could it include their financial health? Could it include their familial health? We don't know. And so we're going to see the right, having lost this initial ballot fight in terms of raising the threshold. Now, how well a job do they do in explaining what's in this initiative? And more importantly, do Republicans in Ohio offer an alternative that would be more acceptable to voters? Because that's been one of the problems, too, is the left has been very successful in making the argument that, look, you either vote for these abortion initiatives that we're putting into the Constitution, or you get left with a very restrictive abortion regime, which is what Republicans are proposing in the legislature. And that choice is presented to a lot of voters. We're seeing how they're falling in terms of these end vote totals.